Hello, this is Carol Dancer and welcome to I-9 Coding. Our objective today is to interpret the I-9 chapter-specific coding guidelines. So let's get at our I-9 coding book. The chapter-specific guidelines are your general rules for I-9 coding. So these give the coders specific instructions for coding certain diseases and conditions. So let's get at our I-9 coding book and turn to the chapter-specific coding guidelines. You'll see there, Chapter 1 is infectious and parasitic diseases, and it gives you in parentheses the code range for this section. In this case, it's 001 through 139. The chapter-specific coding guidelines are arranged by body system. For example, the respiratory system, circulatory system, infectious diseases. So depending on the case that you're coding, you would need to consult the chapter-specific coding guidelines in order to get the specific guidelines on how to code that particular case. We've already said that Chapter 1 was infectious and parasitic diseases, and this includes HIV/AIDS, it includes sepsis as an example of an infectious disease. If you flip the page and you turn over, you'll see Chapter 2 is neoplasm. It gives you a code range there of 140 through 239. So if you were coding a case and a patient had cancer, this is where you want to go to get those specific instructions. For example, one of the guidelines in this section tells you that if a patient is admitted solely for the purpose of chemotherapy, you have to sequence the chemotherapy as the principal diagnosis and not the cancer. So if you didn't go to these guidelines, you would not know that, and you would record the wrong code for reimbursement. Another coding guideline for neoplasms that you need to be aware of, a lot of times patients that are undergoing cancer treatment become dehydrated. So the coding guidelines tell you that if the patient's being admitted for the sole treatment of that dehydration is going to be the principal diagnosis and not the cancer itself. If you flip over to the next page, you'll see Chapter 3 coding guidelines. This is endocrine, nutritional, metabolic diseases, and immunity disorders. It gives you a code range here of 240 to 279. This includes diabetes. So if you were coding a diabetic chart, you'd want to come here to get those chapter-specific coding guidelines. Let's do an example to be sure you understand how to interpret the chapter-specific coding guidelines. We have a patient that is a known HIV patient that was involved in a motor vehicle accident. They sustained a left hip fracture, and then they were taken by ambulance to the hospital for treatment. So you want to ask yourself, what coding guidelines do I need to consult? HIV is considered an infectious disease, so we want to go to Chapter 1. Let's go there now. Chapter 1, infectious and parasitic diseases. And underneath that you see A, you see HIV, then you see 1, code only confirmed cases. This indicates to the coder that the physician has to specifically state that the patient has a confirmed case of HIV. You cannot code probable or suspected HIV. There has to be an actual documentation of a confirmed case of HIV. Number 2 says selection and sequencing of HIV codes. You've got patient admitted for an HIV-related condition. So if your patient was being admitted for an HIV-related condition, you would follow this particular directive. So this is not what we're looking for. So we're going to search further in the coding guidelines for this section. Look at B. It says patient with HIV disease admitted for an unrelated condition. The key word here is unrelated. We already know they have HIV. They're involved in the motor vehicle accident. So in this particular case, the coding guideline states if a patient with HIV disease is admitted for an unrelated condition, such as a traumatic injury, the code for the unrelated condition, the traumatic nature of the code, should be the principal diagnoses. Other diagnoses would be followed by the HIV. So in our example, we would first code the hip fracture as a principal diagnosis, followed by 042 for HIV. The key thing here being that this is it's unrelated. The reason for their admission is the fracture and not the HIV. So my best practice to you for the chapter-specific coding guidelines is go through here and get yourself a highlighter, multiple highlighters in some cases, and highlight each particular section. For instance, neoplasms, infectious diseases, circulatory system, then review the specific guidelines under each. Also, best practice is to get some tabs, such as this. You can get some sticky tabs, and you can just stick these on the edge of the guideline. You can just write on there circulatory system, infectious, or whatever, and that way it's easy for you to thumb through and easily get to those chapter-specific coding guidelines. So just to sum up, anytime you're coding, you must go to your chapter-specific coding guidelines to get those specific instructions. I hope you have found this helpful.